What's going to happen tonight is Nicholas is going to talk for about 50 minutes, then we will have tea and cake and biscuits, and then we will have questions and answers. So hopefully there'll be plenty of time to discuss all the things that Nicholas is going to raise. I ought to mention also it's nice to have the Loudon Bookshop represented here tonight with a display of Nicholas's books. Nicholas has written, I think the programme says 47, but you now told me that it's 49.
It is, yes.
So Nicholas has written no less than 49 books. He's very prominent as an author. He's very prominent as a member of the local community, particularly as the driving force behind the Oak Tree group of schools. And he's also someone who's very well travelled, as you'll know just from the brief biography even in the programme here. He spent quite a lot of time in the Middle East and in East Asia and all over the world doing quite a lot of different things. We're welcoming him back this year because last year he told us a lot about his life and his experience, very rich experience that he's had over his life. And now he's going to be talking us this evening as a kind of follow-on from that about his reflections on those experiences, some of which he's incorporated into his books. You'll see there's a book there about world government and a world constitution. And I think he'll be talking about those as we go along in the evening. So, Nicholas, I'm handing over to you, and we look forward very much to hearing what you have to say.
I hope you won't mind if I sit so I can operate the slideshow. I'm grateful to Loudon Festival for inviting me again, and I'm pleased to be back at St Mary's. I danced on the vicarage lawn here in 1944 and 1945, and on the left is a picture of a dance with fishing rods that day, but I was out of shot. In those days the church looked as on the right. The annual Oaklands Carol service is held here. One year, in 1992, I asked actually my wife, who's here, where I was sitting, and was told, "You're not, you're taking the service, the vicar hasn't turned up," so I was vicar for the day. My presentation last year, Epping Forest and a Literary Life, was on how my 49 books were influenced by Epping Forest. It can be viewed via a link on my website. Today, my theme is my worldview, and we'll be leading up to those two books, both out next month. And I must stress, this is going to be a pragmatic talk. I'm looking at what I gleaned from my time abroad, and I've come up with some pragmatic suggestions. The UK nation-state now faces, after Brexit, if it leaves the customs union, a similar global outlook and international involvement to what it faced in the 1960s, when the British Empire was in decline. After Suez, the UK was trading on its own, and we hadn't joined the common market. As a young man, I experienced the Cold War of the 1960s, when the Soviet Union and Communist China were in conflict with the US in proxy local wars that the UN couldn't prevent. I spent the 1960s lecturing at universities overseas, underwritten by the British Council, exporting English language, literature and culture to the Middle and Far East to strengthen trade links. Here is a group of 17 receiving training through a British Council-sponsored course at Dunford House, Midhurst, Sussex, in 1961. I'm second from the right in the back row. We were all bound for different countries, and I was bound for Iraq, which was then a backwater and not the most prominent place that we now understand by Iraq. There's a similarity between that time and our present time, which has recently returned to Cold War with Russia. Today I'm sharing 5 lessons I've learned since 1961 and the conclusions I've drawn. These 5 lessons have become the 5 principles behind my worldview. The first lesson I learned was that competing nation-states' self-interest leads to conflict and war that doesn't benefit all humankind. From 1961 to 1962, I lectured at the University of Baghdad in Iraq. Here I am in 1961, the class of my students at the University of Baghdad, in the cafeteria. At Dunford House, we were reminded that Churchill, my MP, our MP, during the war in Loughton, shown top right, visiting Loughton in 1945, that's by the War Memorial, Churchill set up Iraq as a nation-state in the ruins of the Ottoman Empire in 1922, when he was Liberal Secretary of State for the Colonies, before he joined the Conservative Party in 1924. And we were told that the UK's role in Iraq in 1961 was to maintain Churchill's policy of keeping Sunnis, Shias and Kurds together in the nation-state he founded. I was supposed to implement this togetherness. We were actually told that. Keep the Shias, Sunnis and Kurds together. And that's what I was doing. A student was stabbed to death in the corridor, but there was never any violence in my lecture room. But the Kurds were being bombed by the nationalist Iraqi government, mainly Sunni. This Kurd in the enlargement asked if he could miss my next lectures and go home to Kurdistan for a week, because he hadn't heard from his family. He found his village was lumps under snow, and all his family were dead. He buried them himself in the mountainside. Then he came back and was back in my class. I wrote a story about him. Today, many of those students would be Sunni terrorists. Al-Baghdadi, the founder of IS, who's shown on the bottom right, was a student at the University of Baghdad in the 1990s. Young people going out to Iraq today to sell the UK to get trade deals would have to be on their guard for suicide belts. Iraq was a dictatorship under Brigadier General Qasim. He led the 1958 revolution that killed the king and the royal family and spied on everybody, but I declared there was freedom of speech in my classes. I stood alongside Qasim in a garden at the Turkish embassy, and the Iraqi anthem struck up. He saluted, looking at me out of the corner of his eye, and everyone rapidly backed away and scattered. I didn't know that he was a target for rooftop snipers during the anthem, as he couldn't move. I think there were 28 attempts on his life. On another occasion, I saw the army beating a crowd with batons to line both sides of a road before Qasim came by in an armoured car, waving. In a coup in 1963, he had his head cut off and waved in front of TV cameras. Halfway through the year, my college was taken over by the head of secret police. He announced he was now our dean. All students had to re-register outside the gates beside a Black Maria, and half the students in the picture were taken to prison. I visited them. They were sitting in zoo cages on desert sand in baking heat of 120 Fahrenheit. One of them said through bars, "I'm sorry my homework will not be in, sir, but there are no facilities for writing in this prison." So that's all right, you're excused. After my visit, all my students were released. Here's an alleyway I used to walk through in Baghdad every day between buses. I called it Smallpox Alley. It's an Ottoman Turkish medieval street. Notice the open sewer and the children with bare feet. Many had trachoma, the eye disease which can lead to blindness, spread by flies in conditions of poor sanitation, such as an open sewer. I took these two pictures. I saw acute poverty and suffering in medieval streets. Many lived in mud huts on the edges of Baghdad. I was invited in for tea by the occupants of one as I walked past. I was told 20 were living there on a weekly income of 4 shillings and twopence. That's 20p. 2 bottles of yoghurt sent to the market. 20 people living on 1p each a week, no welfare state, and they still invited me to share their tea. That's the generosity of the traditional Arab. The Iraqi regime were anti-imperialist, anti-UK, anti-Israel, pro-Soviet communist, and Arab nationalists with a strong army. It was a new nation state, potentially at war with most of the neighbours, as you see today in the Middle East. It did not benefit humankind. My worldview had turned against Arab nationalism and nationalist dictatorships. Soon after I returned to the UK, the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 took place and dramatically conveyed the Cold War context of that time. Khrushchev had sent nuclear weapons to Cuba to threaten the US. Kennedy made him withdraw the weapons. I remember being in the Charing Cross Road when there was a loud bang and everybody thought it was a nuclear weapon. Panic in the streets of London at that time. The US had 6 times as many nuclear weapons as the Russians, but the Russians had caused the Cuban crisis and were endangering the world. A competing nation state leading to war, leading the world to the brink of war. I was in Japan from 1963 to 1967. Here I am in the West Essex Gazette, now the Guardian series, in the centre, about to go to Japan, and on my arrival outside my bungalow study window in Tokyo, that's the bottom left. I lectured at 3 universities in Tokyo. I was a professor at one of them at the age of 24. And from my professor emeritus at another of them, the aging poet Junsaburo Nishiwaki, top right, I learned the wisdom of the East. Plus A plus minus A equals 0, or great nothing, which he wrote out on a card I had, and that's in the bottom right. In other words, all opposites are reconciled in an underlying unity. Plus A plus minus A, opposites, reconciled in a unity. I was also tutor to Prince Itachi, Emperor Hirohito's second son, from 1965 to 1967. I planned his state visit to the UK in October 1965. These pictures were taken by a chamberlain when Prince Itachi and Princess Hanako invited me to dinner in their palace. I also taught the vice-governor of the Bank of Japan. The lower building was the building I used to teach him in. He took a phone call from the governor of the Bank of England, Lord Cromer, in one of my lessons. He put his hand over the mouthpiece and said to me, "Shall I give the UK a loan?" I said, "Yes." The loan to the UK was clinched in my presence. It demonstrated how hard it was for the UK to exist by its own trade deals in the mid-1960s, as there was a deficit and we had to borrow from Japan. I wrote a speech for the governor, who is shown on the bottom left, to deliver at the opening of the Asian Development Bank. Japan's Chief of Trade Policy asked me to interview 50 officials of the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI, which is shown on the right, and choose 6 multilateral conference interpreters. I had to spend an hour with each and interview them on the trade they were doing for Japan. In MITI, I saw the importance of trade to the UK and how hard it would be to argue with the 50 very bright young men I had to interview. They were all nimble-minded negotiators who put Japan's interests first and would be a handful for our young men seeking trade deals in Japan today. So I saw Japan's economic nationalism at very close quarters. I saw that the Japanese nation-state's self-interest benefited the Japanese, but not the world's poor living in mud huts. So that was the first lesson I learned, that nation-states lead to conflict and war. The second lesson I learned was that communism was tyrannical and did not act in humankind's best interests. And we must remember that communist China today is still communist. From Japan, in March 1966, I visited China with Frank Tui, a novelist and short story writer, who's shown top right, to write 13 newspaper articles, 2 for the Sunday Telegraph, 2 for the New York Times, 8 for AP, and 1 for Newsweek. We also wrote about our visit in the encounter of December 1966. I got to grips with Chinese communism's opposition to many nation-states. The Chinese under Mao were then very anti-American, and children were invited to queue to knock down a life-size effigy of President Johnson. That's on the left. Queues of children, queues and queues, all waiting to whack the American president. He went down and then came back up. China was a one-party state, and Mao was a dictator who had just begun to purge the Chinese population of its bourgeois tendencies, using students to attack the middle class. We went via Canton, which is top left, that's me in the middle of some professors there, Hangzhou, Shanghai, and Nanking to Peking or Beijing, visiting universities. In Shanghai, I visited a commune where they'd locked the landlord in a pigsty, and here he is, bottom left, let out for our visit. So he actually lived in the pigsty. I visited the Match King of Shanghai, top centre, who had £140 million and was under house arrest. He told me he'd been brainwashed. He actually said, wash-brained. I've been wash-brained. And that's me, top right, surrounded by students at Nanking University, and as a teacher with a gun and students under a poster of Chairman Mao in Nanking, all of which was normal in China in those days. In Peking University, we expected to see thousands of students. We found the campus virtually deserted. A professor told us that the third and fourth year students had been sent to be remoulded in the countryside to get rid of their bourgeois ideology. We visited a student's dormitory, and I asked a fifth year student who's on the left, "Why aren't you with peasants in the countryside?" He said, "Because I've got a medical certificate." In other words, it was compulsory to live with the peasants, and he'd been excused. The next day, we managed to give our guide the slip and have lunch in the British legation, which is their equivalent to the British Embassy. It's a step down from the embassy. The Chargé d'Affaires, that's like the UK ambassador in China, but called the Chargé d'Affaires, was agog at our news. I'd scooped the British legation and the world's media with the first news of the Cultural Revolution, which surfaced 4 months later in August 1966. We put our discovery in an article in the Encounter of December 1966. During the Cultural Revolution, everyone had to carry and wave a little red book of Mao's sayings, and you can see them on the right. Many students became Red Guards. Many Chinese were executed. In China, I saw that Mao's communism acted against the best interests of humankind. Mao is thought to have killed 70 million in all, 45 million between 1958 and 1962 alone. My visit confirmed my rejection of communism. In July 1966, I returned from Japan to London via Moscow. I saw Moscow at the height of the Cold War. I absorbed the history of the terrible things done to humankind in the name of the Communist Revolution. Stalin is thought to have killed 60 million, so that's Mao 70 million, Stalin 60 million. I went to the Cathedral of the Archangel. I stood before the icon of the Archangel Michael, that's in the top centre, and had a vision of the end of the Cold War and of the unity of humankind under a world lord. I wrote a poem about communism in Russia and China, Archangel. I asked, and the lines are on the bottom left, how but by containing both sides can we heal this split down the mind of Europe and the world? Another example of plus A plus minus A equals 0, reconciling both sides into a unity. On the right is the end of the poem, which mentions the world lord. The manuscript, like all my manuscripts, is held in my archive at the University of Essex. You can see it online at the link that will be displayed at the end. The poem predicts the end of Soviet communism. My visit to Russia again confirmed my rejection of communism. On my way back from Japan, I looked in on Vietnam and experienced the Vietnam War in Saigon, which is on the left, and Bien Hoa on the right, which is where the final battle of the war took place. I drove through Viet Cong-held villages with American GIs. Our bus had anti-grenade mesh over the windows. The Viet Cong wanted to expand North Vietnam and take over South Vietnam, and again I saw that competing nation states lead to war, and we see it in North Korea and South Korea until just recently. So many competing nation states have led to conflict and war. The third lesson I learned was that the intelligence services of Western nation states preserved Western democratic values against communist-backed extremists in the Cold War. I lectured at the University of Libya in Tripoli from 1968 to 1970. My landlord, an ex-colonel in the Libyan army, invited me to several meetings of ministers, and it became clear that he was organising a pro-Western coup against the very old King Idris with the king's blessing. The ministers said I would be in charge of Libya's oil, meaning that I would be their link to the outside world, and if you wanted to buy an oil field, then you came to me and I passed them on to the right person, because I spoke English. And they said they would demand that I should be the British ambassador to Libya, which is very flattering. The British Secret Intelligence Service found out about this, and I was asked to join MI6 to work for a pro-Western Libya that would preserve Western democratic values. I visited London and interviewed the Libyan ambassador to the UK, he's on the bottom left, who the plotters planned would be the new Libyan leader. Back in Tripoli, I was told that our coup would take place on the 5th of September 1969, but the then unknown Gaddafi had supporters who had infiltrated our meetings. Gaddafi struck first with his coup against King Idris, who's shown top left, on the 1st of September in 1969, 4 days before our coup. I was an eyewitness, and I described that day in my last presentation. Gaddafi knew I was the only Westerner involved in the 5th of September coup. He had me arrested and taken to the radio station to be interrogated, and then had me tailed everywhere by 2 Ford Volkswagens. He had me watched 24 hours a day until I left Libya. When the university reopened, I found I was giving my first lecture to 120 armed students dressed in khaki to defend the revolution. And there were 120 loaded rifles in the aisles or propped against chairs. I just hope the safety catch was on. I was now living under a revolution of extremists and under another dictatorship in a dangerous situation, and again witnessed extreme Arab nationalism. There was Soviet support for Libya via Egypt. Gaddafi supported terrorism, he sent arms to Northern Ireland, he interfered in the West. I worked hard to keep the government informed of all that was happening in Libya, on the side of democratic values against tyranny. Gaddafi came to the University of Libya on the 1st of January 1970, and we all lined up outside to greet him. He got out of his jeep near me, my students rushed forward to embrace him, and he was thrown up against me. And he was actually leaning against my shoulder. His Hitler-style peaked cap in the centre was on the rim of my left shoulder, because I was taller than he was. And I shrugged, and his hat rolled off into the dust. So I actually knocked Gaddafi's hat off. But it wasn't intentional, or seemed to be intentional. At 2 a.m. one hot night in May, I was arrested and taken to a villa by the shadowy Mohammed Barassi, who was in charge of presenting the regime in the media and of watching foreigners, a Libyan Robespierre. He said he had had my apartment searched and knew that I was a British agent. He produced a Luger, shown on the right, and for 3 hours threatened me with execution. He was told by phone, I believe by Jaloud, Gaddafi's number 2, that he had to report my execution to the British ambassador in advance. He rang and rang, but couldn't get through. It was the middle of the night, and the British embassy weren't answering, thank goodness. And so I was released at 5 a.m., but I was told I had to go back that night. I gate-crashed the British ambassador's Queen's birthday reception at his residence. He's in the centre. and jumped the greeting queue of about 200 people, marched to the front and said, "I need to speak to you," to explain that I was on my way to my possible execution. The ambassador, Sir Donald Maitland, said, "You must go. The Revolutionary Command Council are in power. They are the law. You've got to go." So I went and was pushed around and mildly beaten up by Barassi and 3 Syrians, and then released. Barassi was later Libya's ambassador to the UN. The full story of all this is in My Double Life 1, and the book's over there. During my time in Libya, I saw at close quarters how it was necessary for the UK to trade with an unpleasant regime, the same dilemma we can expect to have after Brexit. Shortly after my near execution, the UK ambassador, Sir Donald Maitland, was appointed Prime Minister Edward Heath's press secretary. On my return to London, and I'm sure that it was through Maitland to compensate me for my ordeal, I was appointed Prime Minister Heath's secret ambassador to the dozen or so African liberation movements. So that was my position, secret ambassador to the liberation movements for Heath. And only 4 people in the country knew that, and Heath was one of them, and the Foreign Secretary was another. The full story of all this is in My Double Life 1. The anti-colonial leaders of the African liberation movements were opposed to South Africa and the West, and were financed by Russia or China. I was working to keep the government informed and to block the liberation movement's plans to take over their nation states and hand over Africa to the communists, Russia and China. I met African liberation movement leaders from SWAPO in Namibia, MPLA in UNITA in Angola, ZANU and ZAPU in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, FRELIMO in Mozambique, and movements in South Africa, Eritrea, the Sahara, and other African states. As a freelance journalist writing for The Times, I interviewed Africans vying to control nation states to make war against Portugal, the colonial power that that ruled Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, and other Western powers. And I again saw the link between nation-state aspiration and war. I was told in September 1971 that I had been betrayed and that Philby in Moscow was about to name me as a British agent in retaliation for Heath's expulsion of 105 Russians earlier that month. Does that sound familiar? This didn't happen, but now it was widely known what I was doing. In 1972, I was sent to Tanzania, a centre for more than a dozen African liberation movement leaders. I was invited by the Tanzanian Foreign Secretary, who's on the left, and I interviewed him for The Times. I met the leaders of ZANU and ZAPU, Herbert Chitepo, who's in the centre, and Jason Moyo on the right. And I walked between them unarmed for several hundred yards into the bush and back as I asked them about their bombing of trains in Rhodesia. Both were dead within 4 years, Chitepo blown up in his car in 1975 and Moyo by a parcel bomb in 1976. I joined a party of Scandinavian journalists and visited President Nyerere, who's top left. I asked him at question time on the veranda of his house if I could go on the Tanzam Railway, which was being built by the Chinese and was off limits to journalists. He said, I don't know. I don't see why not. I later argued with the Minister of Information that he had meant yes, and was grudgingly allowed to go. I spent a night in a Chinese camp on the left, and I found out how the Tanzam Railway was being built. It was a very dangerous time, and I wasn't happy about going into extreme situations when the other side knew what I was doing, and I knew I had books to write. I severed my connection with the intelligence services in 1973. So that lesson was that the intelligence services are on the side of Western values against tyranny. The fourth lesson I learned was that the Soviet Union should end its occupation of Eastern Europe. Or more fully, the Soviet Union's occupation of Eastern Europe was disastrous, and the freedom and peace in Europe during the last 70 years has benefited all European states. During the 1960s, the UK had large trade deficits, and the top rate of income tax rose to 98%. Some of you may remember that. There was great relief when we were allowed into the European Common Market in 1973, as our prosperity would improve. Europe was still half occupied by the Soviet Union. Based in London, I wrote an essay in October 1976, The European Resurgence, about the reunification of a resurgent Europe. I discussed it with Margaret Thatcher in November 1976 at a dinner. I followed this up in 1983 by writing a paper, Free, F-R-E-E, Freedom for the Republics of Eastern Europe. Lord Whitelaw, Margaret Thatcher's number 2, had asked me in the presence of my MP, our MP, Sir John Biggs-Davison, to write a paper he could pass to Margaret Thatcher, and he did. Details are in my double life too. I saw that the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe should end. From 1984 to 1987, besides being a school principal, I was a part-time small publisher, having founded Oak Tree Books, and with a few authors, my few authors, I led a group we called the Heroes of the West. We stood up to those who opposed the West, including the Soviet Union and Gaddafi. In spring 1986, one of the Heroes of the West authors had evidence that the pro-Soviet Gaddafi had potentially nuclear missiles south of Sebha in Libya, pointing at London, Paris and Bonn, threatening Europe. Via the Embassy of Israel in London, to which we were escorted by an armed girl, we got a message onto President Reagan's desk presenting the evidence and requesting airstrikes. These happened on the 14th of April 1986. 20 planes bombed Tripoli, 20 Benghazi, and it was confirmed to me personally by the Embassy of Israel that 15 planes destroyed the missiles south of Sebha to defend Western Europe. This is little known. That's me in the centre, minutes before hearing on the car radio news that the attack had happened. And just to make a lighter note, my wife took the picture when I was unaware, and I was sitting in a mountain stream in the Lake District having been to Wordsworth's house, and my son Tony had just sat in sheep's poo, and my task was to wash his trousers, and I just finished washing them, so if it looks as though I've got something on my mind, then I'm trying to work out how to clean my hands. But it was 15 minutes before I heard about the Libyan raid on the car radio. On the 1st of July 1986, I published the book on terrorism that contained the evidence for the missiles, Des McForran's The World Held Hostage. I launched it within the safety of the Special Forces Club, which is on the right, an arrangement made by our then local MP, Sir John Biggs-Davison. I called for free in November 1986 when I published a book by a Hungarian author, Paul Gorka, Budapest Betrayed. It included a list of the 45 Hungarians who were betrayed by Philby and executed by Hungary's communist regime. I hosted the launch of this book in conjunction with Sir John Biggs-Davison at the Palace of Westminster, which is on the left. The BBC World Service covered my speech live and broadcast it into Russia and behind the Iron Curtain. In a Heroes of the West action, in my speech I challenged the 1943 Tehran Agreement, which regarded East Europe as a Russian sphere of influence. I called on East Europeans to free themselves from the Soviet Union. So that was in 1986. There I am in the centre making my speech with Biggs-Davison looking worried, if not horrified. I never had to pay for the launch. I was told that Margaret Thatcher had arranged for the bill to be settled in view of my broadcast. Paul Gorka introduced me to the Committee of Captive Nations, which represented each Eastern European nation-state and they backed my call for free. One of the committee, the Hungarian Krasho, who's shown on the left wearing blue, implemented my idea of obtaining 120 prominent East European signatures on a petition calling for freedom from Soviet occupation and for democracy in 4 Eastern European countries. He collected 122 signatures. And they were all ministers, very high level, in their Iron Curtain countries. Through Paul Gorka, I was offered a castle in Hungary as a headquarters for free, FREE. In April 1990, I visited Budapest and looked at a couple of castles. However, I had just founded Kubaseo Hall School and had ceased to be a publisher, and the Berlin Wall had been breached in November 1989. The Soviet Union would soon be leaving Europe. Europe would soon be unified. Free had triumphed, so I declined the offer of a Hungarian castle. It's only now that people are realizing that through Free, FREE, Paul Gorka, Krasho, and I, supported by Big Stavison and other heroes of the West, made a huge contribution to the reunification of Europe. And a French journalist, Charles Rollet, interviewed me recently about Free. Paul Gorka's son, Sebastian Gorka, he is now Trump's second assistant in Washington, and he's in touch with me about what we did. So he sees Trump every day now. Strange that he came out of this background, really. So the fourth lesson was how Russia must get out of Eastern Europe and what we did to try and make that happen, and unify Europe as a result, so that the EU at present is actually in our debt. The fifth lesson I learned was that after centuries of wars and division, the world should be unified into a democratic world state through universalism, which offers the prospect of world unity. So nation states lead to war. A world state that includes nation states might stop the wars. That's where I'm coming from. And now I become a bit controversial. 10 years ago I took stock of the world. My research showed that the UN has failed to stop 162 wars since 1945. 162 wars since 1945. And there are incredibly 72 wars currently being fought in different parts of the world. 72 right now. And there are still 14,900 nuclear weapons, and there were none when I was born. None when I was 5. America was the sole superpower, but the power of Russia and China had increased, and they seemed expansionist, and no one seemed to be able to do anything about the wars and nuclear weapons. I was now aware of the need for political universalism, new thinking. So my philosophy is universalism, which sees the whole world as being ordered as one world state, as an interconnected unity with a world government. 193 nation states, all together, not making war on each other. I couldn't see any other way of stopping all the wars and impounding all the nuclear weapons to make a better world for our school children and grandchildren. I wrote about political universalism in the New Philosophy of Universalism 2009, and again in the World Government 2010, and called for a democratic world state. I was awarded the Goosey Peace Prize for Literature in 2016. I was led to understand for pursuing peace by following the tradition of Truman, Einstein, Churchill, Eisenhower, Gandhi, Russell, J.F. Kennedy and Gorbachev in calling for a democratic, partly federal world state. I called again for a democratic world state during my acceptance speech in Manila in the Philippines before 7,000, which was televised. There's a video link on my website. I describe this in Peace for Our Time. In Manila, I was approached by a Syrian diplomat close to the Syrian Prime Minister to visit Assad as a peace laureate to negotiate peace in early 2017. I had to send Assad one of my books through the official channel with a message that I wrote to Assad in Manila. My visit never happened. Assad was widely reported to have had a stroke shortly before I was due to go in, and the moment was missed. You can find it online. If you Google Assad stroke, you'll see that his brother ran the country for part of the time. Lots about Assad's stroke online, but not in the press, of course. My 15-point peace plan for Syria is in Peace for Our Time. Peace for Our Time is a reflection on a looming Third World War, on Russia threatening the Baltic states, invading Crimea and East Ukraine, and fighting pro-US groups in Syria. There seemed to be a new Cold War, which a world state would end. I was asked to write the definitive work on world states, and I wrote World State out in June 2018, next month. It's an introduction to the United Federation of the World, UF, whose elected lower house, the World Parliamentary Assembly, can be based in the UN General Assembly and eventually replace it. Under the UF, all nation states will stay as they are internally, but will give up authority to the federal elected UF in 7 areas, just 7 areas. The UF will declare war illegal and confiscate nuclear weapons from all nation states, redistribute resources and energy, ease environmental problems, including global warming, end disease, end famine, solve the world's financial crisis, and redistribute wealth to help poverty. In an act of statecraft, I also wrote a World Constitution for the United Federation of the World, World Constitution, also out in June 2018, in 145 articles. Both covers show the UN General Assembly. You see the UF on the World Constitution cover. For the last 4 months, Boris Johnson and other members of the government with international responsibilities have been considering these 2 books and considering how the ideas in these 2 books can be taken forward, and if the government's future post-Brexit policy should include looking ahead to a new world structure that can begin the process of bringing world peace and alleviating poverty. The name United Federation of the World comes from lines by Tennyson in Locksley Hall, 1842, which refers to the federation of the world. For I dipped into the future, far as human eye could see, saw the vision of the world and all the wonder that would be, till the war drum throbbed no longer, and the battle flags were furled, in the Parliament of Man, the federation of the world. There the common sense of most shall hold a fretful realm in awe, and the kindly earth shall slumber lapped in universal law. Tennyson must be here, because what I've been saying today is actually giving flesh to his vision and to those 8 I mentioned earlier. The United Nations, the UN, would become the United Federation of the World, the UF. The UN would become the UF, which would have teeth. I followed these 2 books up with King Charles the Wise out in December 2018. It's a masque in which Minerva, goddess of wisdom, is sent by Zeus as an ambassador to Prince Charles in the throne room at Buckingham Palace about the UK's post-Brexit global role. I sent the book to Prince Charles on the 20th of April, the day he was confirmed as the next head of the Commonwealth. And there will be a selection of my poems made by the Earl of Burford in 1999, when he was my literary secretary at Otley Hall, Visions of England, out in January 2019. These poems anticipate Brexit themes. The Earl of Burford is a direct descendant of the 3rd Earl of Southampton, Shakespeare's patron. Shakespeare addressed his dedications to Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece to Southampton in 1593 and 1594. Prince Charles's 70th birthday is in November, and the Prince will attend a celebration of his work in several fields in the Canterbury Cathedral precinct on the 17th of November. In a very recent development, I've been asked to recite a poem from Visions of England about Canterbury Cathedral that I wrote in 75 before they all go into evensong in Canterbury Cathedral. And I am to talk about his coming role as the next head of the Commonwealth, representing 53 nation states and working for harmony among the world's peoples. So in conclusion, I've shown how my worldview progressed through 5 lessons I've learned: that competing nation-state self-interest leads to conflict and war that doesn't benefit humankind, that communism was tyrannical and did not act in humankind's best interests, and that includes communist China now, that the West's intelligence services preserve Western democratic values, that the Soviet Union's occupation of Eastern Europe was disastrous, and that the freedom and peace in Europe during the last 70 years has benefited all European states, and that after centuries of wars and division, the world should be unified into a democratic world state through universalism, which offers the prospect of world unity. These 5 lessons have become the 5 principles behind my worldview. I've shown my progress from witnessing the political and economic nationalism of nation-states in a divided Cold War world to working to heal division by calling for European unity and then for world unity, a call that originated in the vision I had in Moscow in 1966 and culminated 52 years later in World State and World Constitution. Recently, the world seems to have lurched back to 1966 with the attack involving a nerve agent in Salisbury and the expulsion of over 150 Russian diplomat spies from 28 countries and NATO's Russian mission and renewed Cold War. But my vision of a democratic world state still offers an alternative to perpetual Cold War for the coming generations. I started by saying that the UK nation-state now faces, after Brexit, if it leaves the customs union and doesn't rejoin the EU, a similar global outlook and international involvement to that of the 1960s before it joined the common market in 1973. After 46 years of political alignment with Europe, during which the UK's productivity increased at a faster rate than the US's, we could go forward to a better version of how things were in the 1960s, when as a seafaring nation and as a global UK, we struggled for trade deals and to balance our books in a world divided by Cold War. But the world has moved on and become more independent and globalized. And we now have the internet and instant communications with satellites and everyone in the world. Can we go further forward and begin the process of creating a democratically elected world state for our schoolchildren's generation? Time will tell. If we can, then my 2 books out in June 2018, World State and World Constitution, may come to be regarded as founding that world state, a UF that would replace the UN. So I leave you with this question: is there a better way for our school children and grandchildren than doing things as in the 1960s, with more Cold War, more local wars, and perhaps a 3rd World War? Here in Hope Centre, can we see hope for the world? Can we look further forward and begin the process of making a peaceful, democratic world state happen and bring in a better, safer world for our school children and grandchildren? Thank you for your attention. And it's now time for tea.